everybody, welcome into another edition of Lunch Hour Live. I'm Sue O'Connell here at the Boston Public Library at the GBH studio. What another great moment we've got for you, another opportunity. Joining me for our third installment of our Author Talk series is New York Times best-selling author and Boston native William Martin. He's the author of, just 12 books that you may have heard of. They're historical novels. His latest being December 41. It's a World War II thriller, and we're going to talk about that today. Bill, great to see you. Welcome to Lunch Hour Live.
Sue,
thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's lead off.
Great to be anywhere after the pandemic.
I know, right? Just great to be out of the house. Can you indulge us with reading an excerpt just to set the tone for us and the stage for where we are with this? It's William Martin, December 41.
I'll read the beginning.
There you go. Start at the beginning.
You give me one of these signs when I've gone on too long. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone. War encircling the earth. War once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered, while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. And that's how the book begins.
And that's where we are, obviously,
Yes.
In 1941, World War II.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily about World War II, right? There's a driving plot narrative.
Yep.
Tell us about some of your characters and what we can expect them to do in December 41.
Well, I got the idea for this book when I was watching the movie Desperate Hours with Gary Oldman a few years ago. And there's a scene in the book where Churchill calls Roosevelt and begs for help. France is falling. The Germans are advancing on Dunkirk. Churchill asks FDR for anything that he can give, and FDR says, "I can't help you because my hands are tied by American politics." And as I was watching that film, I thought to myself, in a year and a half, right after Pearl Harbor, these two men, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, will stand together on the south portico of the White House to light the national Christmas tree, to express the unity of the Allies in their crusade against fascism and Japanese imperialism, and what a target they will make. And that was where the idea came from, that what would happen if there was an assassin out in that crowd of 20,000 people who watched them on that Christmas Eve and who heard the resounding speeches that FDR and Churchill gave that night. And out of that grew the idea for this novel, which begins on the other side of the country with a German assassin who escapes an FBI dragnet in Southern California, where there was a very strong presence of fascists and German sympathizers and so forth. And his job is to get to Washington and shoot FDR on the night that he lights the Christmas tree.
And as he travels to do this, and as other characters are also will eventually intersect, it does give you this building foreboding that, you know, as I'm reading it, I'm almost forgetting that it's fiction.
And if I'm doing my job
Right.
well, you're almost forgetting that FDR and Churchill escaped that night.
Right.
Once the assassin makes it to the ellipse at the end of the book, it's Christmas Eve, the music is playing, and there's great festivity in the air, and there's tremendous tension among the characters trying to find this German assassin. If I've done my job right, you'll be saying to yourself, "Oh man, I hope he doesn't get them. I hope they stop him." But that's one of the things that makes historical fiction and historical drama like this work. The sense of the possibility that it could have happened. And not only are you invested in the experience of being with FDR and Churchill in the final scenes of the book, but you're also invested in the lives of those characters. The FBI agent who has bucked authority in order to go after this guy and track him down. The Hollywood screenwriter who has found himself at one point on the same train as this guy and is now suddenly the suspect. These are kind of Hitchcockian tropes, by the way, that you can remember from the old Hitchcock movies. Because when I wrote this book, I envisioned it as a kind of Hollywood drama from the 1940s. There's the young actress who just can't make it in Hollywood. You know, she keeps trying, and we meet her when she's trying to get a job as a waitress in order to keep alive her dream. And then this German asks her, "Well, I have a role for you.
I've got a role of a lifetime for you."
Yes, will you play my wife? So that she will deflect suspicion from him as they travel across the country. So there are all kinds of interesting characters who pop into this, including cameos by Humphrey Bogart and his wife, the battling Bogarts, and Musso and Franks, John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich having lunch after perhaps a little row in the hay. We don't really know. However, there was an interesting match. John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich, and they really were an item in the 1940s. So in the first third of the book, there's a lot of Hollywood gossip, a lot of sense of what's going on in Los Angeles, which is the closest American city to the perceived Japanese threat. They didn't know on December 8th or 9th or 10th where the Japanese fleet was. Those aircraft carriers could have been headed for the Pacific coast. A lot of people thought that they were. So there is a tremendous sense of tension running in the background of the book, and that's just supporting the larger sense of tension that you feel over what this assassin is capable of.
I'm talking with William Martin. His book is December 41. If you're with us at the Newsfeed Cafe here at the Boston Public Library, we're happy to take your questions for Bill. So when you're writing historical fiction, do you feel, especially, you know, it's funny, this is now the middle part of the last century this book is set, right?
Yes,
So it's not like it was my mother's time, as I might refer to it. How much of a burden do you feel, or responsibility do you feel, to really set the detail of what life was like? Like, as I'm reading this, I'm reminded, you know, my dad served in World War II, and some of the references like that. What's the main job of one of the characters? What does he do for a living?
Well, there's
he makes hats.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that even exist right now?
No.
Right. You know, and so I'm imagining someone reading this and having to look up what the word means.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you're writing this, in writing all of your historical fiction, do you feel this burden of how much detail to put in and how much to leave out?
Well, I never see it as a burden. I actually kind of enjoy it, because the details that you insert into a book and find subtle ways to present them, those details are the things that help you to create a sense of reality in the reader's mind, a sense of verisimilitude. This was the world as it was. What are they eating? What, for example, is on the menu at Musso and Frank's, and how much does it cost? You know, the famous Hollywood watering hole right there on Hollywood Boulevard. And at one point, I have a character sit down to a meal in Musso and Frank's, and he orders Cape Cod oysters at 75 cents a half dozen. Comes right from the menu from Musso and Frank's for 1941, which somehow I found. And similarly, when they get onto the train, the Super Chief, they're going to cross America. And the Super Chief was one of the few ways that you could get from Los Angeles to Chicago. It took 3 days and 2 nights, and it ran twice a week from Los Angeles to Chicago and vice versa. There were a few other trains, but none quite so comfortable and luxurious. And I found that out in Sacramento, they have the restored dining car. You know, there are a couple, you've read the book, you know, there are a lot of scenes on the dining car. Well, when I walked onto that dining car at the Sacramento Railroad Museum, I just looked and I said, I'm in my book. I'm living it. You know, and I could describe the china and the walls and the carpeting and take pictures of the displays which described the things that were on the menu there, so that when they order a larded tenderloin of beef, it comes right off the menu. And all of those things give me the ability to create a sense of reality that will support whatever fiction I'm trying to invent. And we know that nobody shot at FDR and Churchill. But as I said earlier, if I've done my job correctly, with interesting and compelling characters in a world that seems real, as this one I think does, then you'll be turning pages very quickly as you come to the end of the book.
One of the things I talk when I get to speak to college students or high school students and talk about journalism or talk about our place in the world, I try to impart upon them that everyone at every moment is always living history.
Yes.
You know, what's happening right now, what happened last year, what's going to happen next year. You know, if you're paying attention, when you get old enough, your grandchildren will ask you what it was like to be in this time, to be in this day right now. And I'm wondering, as you're going through your writing process, how much of this knowledge of knowing what happened, you know, when we look back at the past, we can connect dots that as people living their day-to-day lives as they are in your book, many people are just living, you know, not paying attention to how the big picture happens. Do you feel the urge to connect the dots or write plot lines that bring you places, or do you just let the characters emerge?
I think the dots connect themselves. The most important thing is always to tell a good story, a story in which the dilemmas of the various characters are things that either you can identify with or you're really interested in. How are they going to solve this problem? Including the German assassin who more than once gets into a situation where he thinks, this person knows too much, I'm going to have to kill them. And you lean forward and say, is he going to do that or will he not do that? And so once you've done that work well, anything else that you build into it will keep your reader living in that world. And if you've written well enough, once they're living in that world, they will begin to have the sense that these people are just like us. These people who are dealing with this set of circumstances, a war, a sudden violent attack on the United States on December 7th, and nobody seemed to expect it, although the people in Washington did. If you as a reader will be saying, if they could endure whatever they went through, we can endure what we are confronting. Because, we're living history too. Now, there's a great comment from, I believe it was Hegel. Not that I read a lot of Hegel, but he once said, We learn from the past that we never learn from the past. Human nature never changes, but the circumstances do, and the events do, and they become like, those events become like the different theaters in which we are able to put our characters and allow them to perform for us. And that's why I like to write historical fiction.
Question from someone in the audience. We touched on this a little bit, you know, visiting, looking at menus and visiting diner cars, but what's your research process for a book like this, and is it the same for every single book that you work on?
You try to do multiple kinds of research. The first sort of research is a mile wide and an inch deep. You read generalized texts about the event that you're writing about and about the people who will be involved. Churchill and Roosevelt don't really appear until at the very beginning and then at the end of the book. But I needed to know a lot about them, so I read The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson, which was very popular a couple of years ago. I read No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin about the Roosevelts during the 30s and 40s. And then you start boring the holes a little bit more deeply into the book or into the subject matter. I needed to know, even though it never happened in history, I needed to know if the authorities that were charged with protecting Roosevelt gave a lot of thought to the kind of thing that I'm going to write about. And I found a relatively obscure autobiography called Riley of the White House, written in 1946 by Mike Riley, who was FDR's anchorman, the Secret Service agent who was always right beside him, ready, if things went wrong, to pick the president up and run with him. Because, of course, FDR, being paralyzed, couldn't run, couldn't walk. And that book described the concerns of the Secret Service in those first few weeks after the war. While the Army was worried about paramilitary attacks by large groups of Germans, hence the machine guns on the roof of the White House the day after Pearl Harbor, the Secret Service was primarily concerned with just what I propose in the book, the lone assassin or the small team that attempts to find a way to take a shot at Franklin Roosevelt. And that's very important research for me to do, not only because it's filled with details that will find their way into this book, but it's also, it also in a way gives me the green light to go ahead and write this book.
If there's a basis of fact or possibility that they were planning for it, so therefore, or concerned about it.
But the other part of the research that I love to do is that travel part of the research that I was just describing. And lately, across the last 3 books, I've tried to write books in which I was writing about cities where my kids were living.
There you go. Perfect.
I wrote a book about Civil War Washington when my daughter lived in Washington. That was called The Lincoln Letter. My last book was about the gold rush, and that led me to Northern California, and I have another son who lives in Berkeley. And in this book, I have a son who, this book is in Los Angeles, and I have a son in LA, and one of our first trips out to research this novel was to the place where this book begins. And I think people would be quite interested to hear about my little trip to this place. It is the ruins of an old Nazi, neo-fascist encampment right off of Sunset Boulevard in Pacific Palisades, very rich neighborhood, way out west in the city. You drive out Sunset Boulevard, and when you get to the Riviera Country Club, you turn right and go up the hill. Pretty soon, if you follow the fire road, you come to a giant enclosed chain link fence. It surrounds 55 acres that in 1933 was called the Murphy Ranch. Though there was no Murphy and it wasn't a ranch. It had been purchased by neo-fascists who put $1 million into that canyon in the form of power station, fuel tanks, water tanks, and they had engaged an architect who had designed a 40-room mansion that was never built. You can see the plans at UCLA. A 40-room mansion that was to have been Hitler's Western White House. This sounds so fanciful,
Well, when I
so
was
crazy.
reading it, I actually checked it.
Yeah.
Because it was so surprising to me. I mean, in the first few pages, you establish these characters in this place, and it shook me for a moment where I thought, is this real? Is this?
You were saying, oh, this has to be bonkers, but it isn't. You know, the Los Angeles, as I said earlier, was a hotbed of pro-German activity during this period, because primarily the FBI during the 30s in Southern California had been focused on the communists. Remember the Grapes of Wrath and the great fears that they have over communist infiltration. And the LAPD was downright welcoming to a lot of these groups with their anti-Semitic impulses. And so,
and as you write in the book, it's also the challenge of people perceiving Jewish Americans running Hollywood and that being a propaganda machine.
Right. Well, there was a group, the German-American Bund of Southern California, which was like the central German club of all of the far west. It sat on the corner of Figueroa and 14th, where the Staples Center sits today in Los Angeles. And this was a building where you had a bookstore called the Aryan Bookstore, where you could buy German cookbooks and anti-Semitic literature. And it also had a restaurant where you could eat your Schweinehaxe and your Wiener Schnitzel and a lot of other foods that I love, and look at a map on the wall that was tracking the progress of the German armies across Russia. And the auditorium itself was a place where they celebrated, among other things, Hitler's birthday every April, with photographs of the Fuhrer and swastikas, and they all marched around in what looked like brown shirt uniforms. So, and this was right in Los Angeles. And while we couldn't see the Bund Hall, obviously, we could go up into the hills and wander down into that lonely canyon and feel the ghosts that must have been marching around up there on December 8th, 1941, when the FBI shut them down. And that's the kind of research that I just love to do.
That's amazing. That is just one of the things I love about your work and also historical fiction is the things I learn from it that just don't make it into the history books or not in my realm. So you've written about a number of periods of history.
Right.
A question from our audience: do you have a favorite period of history?
You know, every time I sink into a world, and every day when I go up to my word processor, when I'm writing, my word processor is like a time machine. Every world that I sink into is someplace that I really want to be. You know, I'm looking at the traffic going by here on Boylston Street, and if I just exercise a little bit of imagination, I can take myself back to my first novel, when this is nothing but mud and a thin coating of tidal water that comes in and out twice a day. I think
that being Back Bay, of course.
Right, the book was Back Bay. I've written a lot about the American Revolution in the late 18th century in America, and I think that if I could go back and write one more book set in any historical period, it might be that one. I used to be friendly with David McCullough because you know I did a film on the American experience on the life of George Washington back in the 90s, and he said to me, you know, if I could just stay in the 18th century, I think I wouldn't come back.
I wouldn't complain.
And I said, until you had a toothache, then you might change your mind.
Yeah, there's a number of things that might turn that around.
One of the great things about being able to experience the past in a book, whether it's a novel, nonfiction, whether you're looking at photographs or television programs, is that you can experience the excitement of it without the pain.
Good point.
And it could be a pretty miserable place back there. You drop down into the Civil War, a time that you imagine being so heroic, and then you think about the heroism of men throwing themselves into walls of musket fire with enormous 57 caliber projectiles flying at them, and you say to yourself, I'm glad to be right here, right now, despite COVID.
Plus, I always point out to people, it's really smelled in the past.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
I know folks are eating lunch, but that's always my indication.
Well, after they filled the back bay, the mode of transportation was the horse and buggy.
And it smelled even worse.
Right.
So there you go.
And then they came right up Boylston Street here with the subway, which was a cut and cover subway that was built way back, like in the first or second decade of the 20th century, and transportation got a little bit better after that.
All right, so as we wrap up here, William Martin, author of many books, the most recent, December 41. If people are aspiring writers,
Yep.
Another question from our audience, do you have any advice for them about becoming a writer, staying a writer, being a professional writer?
Well, the key to being a professional writer is to treat it like a job, to do it every day. Even if you have a real job, and I've never considered what I do to be a real job, it's an obsession and a passion, but it's not a real job. You simply need to sit down every day and try to fill pages, because it isn't easy. It's no easier for me today than it was when I struggled to write Back Bay. And the only truth is that you may get better at it. I'm a better writer now than I was then. I understood then, however, that the most important thing for mainstream popular fiction is plot velocity. Story has to move. You know, you have to write about characters who want something and characters who get somewhere. And if you can do that as a beginning writer, if you can answer every day these questions, what does the main character want? Who stands in their way? Why here? Why now? If you can answer those 4 questions, that'll help you every day to fill a few pages. As to whether you will have the good fortune of making the New York Times bestseller list, or in my case, of lasting now for a long time, that remains to be seen. But if you feel like you have to write, sit down and write, because if not you, then who?
Go. All right, William Martin. I'm actually going to use those questions to myself every morning to get out of bed. What do I want? What am I doing?
Why here? Why now?
William Martin, December 41 is the book. It's a great read. I definitely recommend folks to check it out. Thanks so much for joining us here at Lunch Hour Live at the Boston Public Library. Listen, if you missed any of our author talks, you can visit our YouTube page at the GBH, youtube.gbh, I believe it is. You'll find it. You know how to Google. I'm Sue O'Connell. I appreciate you visiting with us again. I hope to see you soon. Thanks for joining us on the Lunch Hour Live at the GBH studio at the Boston Public Library. Thanks so much.